Hi everyone, Stepan here. You're gonna see the last game I played in the Bošnjaci Open and the most fun one, I have to say. It was a Semi-Averbakh King's Indian, a crazy position in which I attacked with everything I had, but didn't really understand everything. So this is gonna be a fun one. If you have any questions about this setup, please leave them in the comments below. This is something I've been experimenting with and learning to try and punish the King's Indian defense. So I'm playing an opponent rated about 2200. Stronger than me, much stronger. So d4, he plays knight f6, and if you noticed, I played e4 in the previous white game, now I went d4. If I'd played another white game, I would have played c4. So I've decided to play e4, d4, and c4 in equal amounts. So c4, g6, knight c3, bishop g7, and e4, d6, everything standard. But now white doesn't play knight f3. White plays bishop e2 and bishop e3. This is the Semi-Averbakh system. The idea is to support the g4 and to control the g4 square so that there's no knight g4. Therefore, the bishop being on e3 cannot be punished. Now, here black can play e5, c5, knight a6. In most cases, black plays e5, white plays d5, and then this knight reaches c5, either via d7 or a6. And black will try to go a5, a4, a3, undermining the structure where white is going to be castling. Obviously, white wants a kingside attack, so white's going to castle queenside. So bringing this pawn to a3 is extremely useful because it tries to undermine this whole diagonal. Okay, but my opponent played knight bd7, and knight bd7 is rare, but it's not bad. It's the same idea. They want to go e5, and after d5, knight c5, followed by a5. So we are going to transpose to the main lines. I went g4. Now, I don't have to go g4. I can go knight f3 and play a sensible position, a standard King's Indian, but I don't want to. I want to attack him, so g4. The idea is g5, h4, h5, checkmate. Okay, he played e5, I played d5, and he played a5. Now, again, the idea is to prevent any b4 before the knight reaches c5. You don't want to get your knight evicted. And the follow-up is a4, a3, long term. Okay, so g5, knight e8. Now, white is already plus 1.5, but the engine always likes white in the King's Indian. This is still my prep, and I still have a ton of prep in this position. White is always better according to the engine, but don't let that fool you. Black has excellent counter chances, and it may seem that black is in trouble, and if black isn't careful, black is in trouble, but white has to play perfectly. So h4. The idea is h5, open up the h-file, get the queen to d3, to h3, and checkmate. Okay, he played knight c5, putting pressure on e4, h5. And here he played f5, which is what I believe you have to play as black. You have to bring this knight back to f6. Now, I've taken on g6, on f6 immediately. I played the gf6. But there's an alternative. Before I show you what I mean, I would like to thank the sponsor of today's video, Chessbook. Working on your repertoire can be tough and tedious and boring, but with Chessbook, it's much easier. Chessbook is a website that helps you import and practice your repertoire in a very easy and understandable way. So what you can do is, you can import your repertoire either by hand or by uploading an actual PGN file, which is what I do. So I go to Lichess, I create a study, I get all the variations in, and then I simply import the PGN. But you can also do it by hand. So let's go to my white repertoire, edit something else. Let's say after d4, I want to look at d5. Okay, so against this, I go c4. Let's say we look at the Queen's Gambit declined. Okay, I take this. Okay, knight c3, knight f6, bishop to g5. They can go bishop e7 or c6. Let's say c6. I go queen c2, not allowing bishop f5. They go bishop e7. I go e3, and so on and so on. You just keep adding moves. You can also add alternatives for your opponent, as well as alternatives for yourself. So if you want to go queen c2, and you also want to have the move e3 as a part of your repertoire, you can upload them both. Now, the best part. Based on the repertoire you've uploaded to Chessbook, you can do two different things. You can connect your online accounts, so lichess and or chess.com, to Chessbook, and it's going to immediately recognize the mistakes you'd made in your online games based on the repertoire you've uploaded. So you can go review online games, and it's going to quiz you on the mistakes from your games. So in this case, I've uploaded some of my black repertoire, some Caro-Kann, some Nimzo Indian, some of my white repertoire against the King's Indian, Nimzo Indian, and so on. So based on my main account, HPY, it's going to find mistakes in my games. You can go review your online games. And now my move is C4. I bet I played the London in that game. Okay, here I go C4 again C4. So Chessbook is correcting my mistake of playing the London system. So that's one thing. Obviously, if your repertoire is done deeper, then the mistakes are going to be more complex. Another thing you can do, which is to me the most useful part, you can practice your repertoire. So you go practice moves. You can practice just the most important moves or the entire repertoire. Let's go everything that's due for review. Okay, it quizzes me on the Nimzo. I allow the Nimzo. Then I go queen c2. In this position I go a3. I take with the queen. Here I go bishop g5. Here I go e3. Okay, now it's quizzing me on the queen's gambit decline, which I've just imported. Knight f6, I go queen c2, I go e3, and so on and so on. Now, in this case, I go knight f6. And basically, you import your repertoire, you get to practice it, you get to review your repertoire by going over mistakes in your online games, which makes studying your repertoire very easy. There's another feature they've added recently, which is play through a model game. So based on your repertoire, Chessbook is going to recommend the game played within your repertoire in one of the variations, and you get to play solitaire chess and guess the next moves of a grandmaster, which is extremely useful. And usually I do that with a notebook and a book, so it requires a ton of time. This is much easier. Now, what I'm using is a premium account. You can upload unlimited moves to your repertoire, which is obviously what you want if you're a serious chess player, but most of what I did can be done with a free basic account too. If you want to visit Chessbook, follow the link in the description below. Support them, they are a great website. Thank you, back to the video. Okay, so I don't have to take on f6. I can actually play hg6, and this is the biggest lesson I've got from this game. Obviously, the pawn's going to remain on f5, and after hg6, I now go knight f3, giving up a pawn. This is huge. This is extremely interesting, and this is a pattern I've learned now, and I cannot wait to play it in an actual game. So if they take, which they will, you go knight h4. Bishop f5 defending the pawn, but now knight f5, rook f5, and queen c2. And the pawn's about to drop. You're going to have excellent chances down the h-file. You're going to regain your pawn, and obviously this bishop is absurd and black's king is extremely weak. +2 for white. +2 for white. What I did isn't bad, but it's not as good as actually ignoring this. So I took on f6. My opponent took with the knight, and I spent a long time here. I should say I wasn't feeling well. I still had the flu, so my vision was blurry. I couldn't focus, and I tried to do my best to play a normal game of chess. So do I defend the pawn, or do I take on g6? I just took on g6. I figured that was good, and if black takes on e4, I can punish that. He didn't, he took on g6, but let's look at knight fe4. If knight fe4, I take on h7, the king of course goes to h8, then I take, black takes, and I simply go knight f3. And let's say queen f6, putting pressure on f2. I can now go rook h2, and after something like bishop f5, let's say, I now go knight h4. Okay, if knight c5, which I think is the best move, then the engine here actually plays king f1 as the best move. I'd be scared to go king f1, and it doesn't seem that clean cut to me. So I'm not sure how this game would have ended had he taken on e4. But I figured that I was fine if I can throw in this gh and open up the g file. In any case, he took on g6. And now this is the key position in the game. I would like to invite you to pause the video here. And this is the most important position. Figure out what you would do. Okay, so there are 4 options. f3 Queen c2, bishop f3, and bishop c5. Those are the ways to defend the pawn on e4. They all have a downside. Firstly, what I thought was the best move, what I'd wanted to play was bishop takes. And after this, I go queen d3, preparing to go knight h3, or in some cases, go queen g3, queen h2. And something like rook a6 seemed interesting. Queen g3, putting pressure on g6 and preparing queen h2. Knight h7. This rook defends. This is what I was expecting against bishop c5. And now simply knight f3. And my plan is to go knight h4, put pressure on g6. But I couldn't figure everything out. And I wasn't sure that I should give away my dark squared bishop, because how do I then weaken the dark squares? How do I get rid of the bishop on g7? It seemed to me that if black manages to break through, I'm just going to be worse. The engine thinks bishop c5 is the second best move. Okay. Another thing I was contemplating was bishop f3. And I was expecting a4, where I go queen d2, a3, b3. This is always going to happen in most lines. And in this position, let's say knight g4. So this was the problem with not playing f3. Knight g4 is allowed, and I have to take it. And after this and this, I can probably go knight e2 and castle queenside, probably, and play for an attack. But again, I've given up the bishop pair, and I wasn't happy about this. In hindsight, the best move, by far, was queen c2. And now the obvious downside to queen c2 is knight g4, which is something I was very afraid to allow. I have to take this. Bishop takes. And now I go f3, giving up a pawn. This is what I was intending. I've given up the bishop pair and the pawn, but I think I have a good position now that I look at it. So bishop takes, knight takes. Rook takes. I can go queen e2. The rook has to move, or the queen has to defend. So let's say queen f6 and castles queenside. When I look at this, this seems absolutely perfect. The fact that I don't have a light squared bishop is irrelevant. Of course, he had given his bishop back. The fact that I'm a pawn down actually helps me. This is a very pleasant position to play. Okay, and finally, the move I'd played in the game has a huge downside, but I saw a way around it. f3, saving the pawn, preventing knight g4, but allowing knight h5, knight f4. And if this is allowed, which of course he did play immediately, my dark squared bishop is inactive, and I don't have a way, an easy way at least, to break that bind, because the h3 square is controlled twice. But I'd intended to go bishop f1 and either bishop h3 or knight h3 to defend that way, to get rid of the f4 pressure. So, and f3 is fine. White is still slightly better, but queen c2 and bishop c5 were both better. So if you found one of those, congratulations, you're better than me. He played knight h5. First I played queen d2. I want to castle queenside and then do this. Okay, knight f4, of course. Castles queenside. And now his next move I did not understand at all. b6, I don't get b6. I don't think this bishop wants to be on a6. But okay. Again, if you turned on the engine plays bishop d7, which makes more sense. It also plays a4, which is normal. It also plays king f7, which seems sensible, just getting away from this kingside pressure. So b6 is, I would say, his only weird move in the game. Now I went through with my plan, bishop f1. Okay, he went a4, normal. And now I have a choice. I either go bishop h3 or knight h3. I really couldn't decide. I was afraid that if I went bishop h3, he would go bishop a6 and then I have to go knight b5, which isn't bad. I mean, if he takes, then that's perfect. He's not going to take. But I can never go bishop e6. So I wasn't sure about this. Of course, I can go knight e2 and try to get rid of this knight that way. I wasn't sure. I don't know what black plays here. Let's say bishop b5, cb5. Okay, and let's say queen e8, attacking the pawn. I can just go bishop f1 and knight h3 if I need to defend. So it seems okay. Nothing major, but it's okay. But I decided to go knight h3. And knight h3, according to the engine, is a serious mistake. Now the position is equal. And of course, if he takes, then I'm extremely happy. this is a perfect position for me now, because I can take on c5, I can take on e6, I can play bishop e6. So for example, if he makes a random move, then takes, and bishop e6. And if we get something like this, I think the endgame is extremely good for me. Like he can win this pawn, that's fine. Or he can take on f3. But let's say he goes for this one, then I go here. And it's not at all easy to defend. If he tries to defend the c pawn, then I can go knight d5. If he goes c6, then I can just defend and put pressure on c6. So this seemed excellent to me, especially because the king doesn't have f7. Maybe I'm wrong. The engine says +4. Yeah, I'm not wrong. I did not check some of the variations with the engine. So yeah, this is +4. Wow. Okay. So he's not going to take. And I didn't believe that he was going to take. He played queen f6, which is a nice move. Now, second serious mistake of the game. I have an attacking position. I'm putting pressure on my opponent. I'm better. This is more than +1. Queen f6 wasn't such a great idea according to the engine. The engine says the position is equal after queen h4, because that pins my rook, so I'm basically forced to go queen h2. And now he can check me on d3, get rid of the bishop, and start taking things. So I'm not sure. For example, knight takes, bishop takes, and now simply rook f3 is good enough, because I'm about to lose my knight. If I move my knight, well, let's say knight f2, then he can just take on h2, take on e3. So queen h4 was better, but queen f6 is still okay. So what are the options? I went for the endgame, which of course is absurd, but I mean, explaining my move is very hard now. I would never play that now. When I look at the position, if one of my students played this, I would say, what's wrong with you? So I took on f4 and went for the endgame with bishop d4. I'm going to show you that. Alternatively, the main candidate move was queen h2. Okay, and after queen h2, again, there's queen h4. If bishop h3, then my position is excellent. I can just take. He cannot win a pawn because he loses the queen. If knight h3, queen f3, then it's game over after queen h7, king f7, and any rook to f1. So he cannot do that. So after bishop h3, if he plays something like queen h4, trying to do something, or here if he plays queen h4 instead of taking in the first place, then I just have bishop f2, and after the queen moves away I can now just take on f4. And when we get this position, his bishop is open, but my position is fine and I have zero weaknesses. I have an excellent bishop pair. I don't know if it's enough to win, but it seemed good enough. Another great option is knight f2, just declining the trades and preparing to go maybe bishop h3, maybe not, maybe knight b5. So let's say bishop d7 developing, king b1, a3, b3, we throw that in. Let's say king f7, he tries to run away, knight b5. This seems very good. I'm keeping all the pieces on the board. d3 is under control, h3 is under control. He's going to be able to exchange the rooks, but there's a weakness on g6. And that's a big weakness. I went for something completely different. I thought that the endgame was good for me, which is, there's no excuse for that. The endgame is equal. The fact that I'd assessed it as better for me is a sign of my endgame weakness. So I have a lot to learn from this game, and hopefully I already have. So knight f4. Of course he takes with the pawn. Otherwise he loses the queen. And now bishop d4, forcing the trade. Okay, queen takes. If he declines the trade, then after bishop takes, queen takes, I just start lining up my pieces down the h-file, and again I have a much better position. I start with something like bishop h3. So queen d4. And now this is forcing takes, takes, takes. Okay, he played a3. And if I go b3, he sacrifices the knight, and I wasn't sure how to assess that. I figured it was equal. So if b3, then of course knight b3, and a b3, and a2, and I have to take it. Otherwise, I get mated. So if I go king b2, he just queens. So takes, takes. And now I was thinking rook d2, and can I possibly have an advantage here? My conclusion was no, and that's correct. There's no way I can win this position. It's just this isn't enough. So after a3, I went for rook d2, trying to quickly get my rooks to the h file. The downside is, of course, that he splits my pawns. And when he trades, I have a weakness on a2. Now I know that according to the engine, this is 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. At that time, I thought this was better. Bishop d7, rook dh2, and he played king g7. Now, sorry, not king f7, king g7. Now, I couldn't see a point to rook h7 check because of king f6. And if I go something like knight e2, I cannot even take the pawn. If rook a7 and I take on f4, then he just plays rook fa8 and I lose. This is dreadful. He's gonna take here and break through, so I cannot do that. Black's winning here. There's no doubt that Black's winning here. Instead, I played bishop h3. I wanted to get rid of my bad bishop, but that leaves the d3 square, so all of a sudden, my position is tactically weak, the f3 pawn is weak. I should say bishop h3 is fine. The position is just equal. But after all the trades, so the game went here, 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 it becomes very hard to defend. I have two weaknesses, three weaknesses basically. He has 0. Okay, maybe 1. Maybe f4 is a weakness, but maybe. And maybe c7. But getting to these can only be done with one piece. I cannot keep my knight on both squares, and they can easily be defended. So I played knight b5 straight away. Now if he doesn't defend, if he plays something like knight e5, then I win because I gain a tempo on the rook, for example, like this. Okay, and then I take on f4. So he played rook c8. And here I played king c3, which is fine. He went knight e5. And pause the video again, I played the losing move here, which shows that the position is tough. Now I had a couple of minutes on the clock. He had more than me, although not much more. He was playing with maybe 15 minutes, and I already had less than 5. Maybe I was down to 2 minutes at this point, I'm not sure. But very quickly, or even at this point, I was in time trouble and playing only on increment, so it's 90 plus 30. I played rook f2, which is absurd. During the game, that seemed like a good option because I didn't want to release the pressure on c7. The alternative, of course, rook h3 fails even worse because of g5, g4. And the second alternative, knight d4, seemed passive because I'm no longer attacking the rook, so rook a8. But rook a8 doesn't work, I can just go knight e6. So for example, king f6, let's say king b4. If rook a8, I now go a4. If g5, I can go rook h6, forcing the king back. Knight f5, forcing the king back. Let's say king g8, and now simply knight back to d4. If he plays g4, I take it. And he cannot take back because of rook g6. So if rook f8, for example, I'm in time to stop this pawn. Let's say I go knight e6. Rook f7. I don't know, let's say rook h1. If he starts pushing with f3, then I can get behind the pawn, and it's fine. When I play... by the way, this is still equal, I cannot win, but I'm holding the pawn. Instead, I played rook f2, and now I'm losing. It's as simple as that. We shuffled our pieces a bit. He, of course, went for the only winning idea, g4, a temporary pawn sack. We repeated once. He played g4. I took. He played king g5, and now I'm just busted. Knight d4. King takes. And my only hope was to get the king to the h file. So I went rook g2, and he played king h4, going back to a draw. Now, this is hard to understand. I was expecting king h3, which is winning. King h4 is a draw. Here's the difference. If I play correctly, king h4 is a draw because of what I'm about to show you. I went rook g7. Okay, he went f3. And now, the way I draw this is knight f5, we check, king h3, king d2, he plays rook a8, I play king e1, he takes on a2, king f1, rook a1 check, king f2, rook a2 check, we can repeat, but eventually he has to go knight d3. And when he goes knight d3, then rook g3 check. Okay, and that's it. After king h4, sorry, after king h3, the same thing doesn't work, because if rook g7, then f3, again king d2, rook a8, king e1, rook a2. I don't have knight f5 check, so king f1, rook a1 check, king here, rook a2 check, king here, knight d3. And if at any point I decide to throw in knight f5 instead of, let's say, king d2, which I should play, if I play knight f5, then he simply goes f2 and queens. So because the king was on h4, I had a chance to play knight f5 check, force the king to h3, and then eventually win the pawn. But he did play king h4. Now at this point I was playing with seconds. Like I only had 30 seconds, which you get per move. Rook g7 still, and now this is a draw, if I play correctly. I played king d2, which is correct. He played rook a8, and everything seems to be working out if I continue king e1, king f1. But I played king e3, and king e3 is simply losing because I cannot reach the f1 square. It's game over now. He played king h3. And now I took on c7. It doesn't make a difference. I cannot take on f3 because he plays rook a3. It's losing, but I remember having 4 seconds on the clock before I took on c7. I just couldn't know what to do. I didn't know what to do. Okay, so rook c7 and he is winning. King f4, f2, rook h7, there's no hope. He gets to h2, and if I check again, he's going to cover with rook h3, so I resigned. I would have resigned sooner had I had more time on the clock, but when you're playing with 4 seconds, then you don't really think about resigning until it's actually over. Congratulations to my opponent. To me, this was an extremely instructive game to play, and I think I learned a bit, but I am going to learn a lot from it. I hope you liked the game. Let me know what you think. Stay tuned for more chess. Bye-bye.